Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really special. We're taking some incredibly complex behavioral data and, well, we're decoding it into clear takeaways. We're going to dive into the fascinating, sometimes kind of heartbreaking, but ultimately absolutely hopeful science of exactly how early childhood experiences shape human behavior.
So, let's just start right out of the gate with a massive question. Is it ADHD or is it trauma? It's a question that researchers and clinicians are actually asking more and more these days. And by the end of this explainer, we're going to completely reframe how we understand what society usually just labels as troubled or disruptive behavior.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the misdiagnosis dilemma, then move into vulnerability in early boyhood. After that, we'll explore when trauma mimics ADHD, look at trauma in juvenile offenders, and finally, we'll wrap up with healing and regaining control.
All right, Section 1, the misdiagnosis dilemma.
So, data from PTSD UK points out that ADHD is highly prevalent. We're talking 3 to 5% of kids and about 2% of adults in the UK alone. But here's the real kicker. Those diagnosis rates, they are absolutely skyrocketing right now. And this rapid escalation is prompting some very serious, hard-hitting scientific questions about overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and the hidden presence of underlying trauma that might actually be driving these behaviors.
Which brings us to Section 2, vulnerability in early boyhood.
Okay, so research shows some really distinct developmental timetables between biological sexes. Infant girls, generally speaking, experience faster development in the frontal cortex, and they show greater self-regulatory behaviors early on. But infant boys, they're on a slower developmental timetable in those specific brain regions. They are highly reactive to maternal emotion and rely really heavily on their caregivers to help them regulate their feelings. So basically, they're biologically more vulnerable to early caregiving inadequacies. So the crucial point here is understanding how that vulnerability actually manifests. When boys who lack self-regulation experience early trauma or severe stress, they tend to do what psychologists call externalizing. That means processing all that frustration, the negative emotions, the trauma, completely outward. It looks like anger. It looks like aggression and rule-breaking. It's so easy for society to just point a finger and label this as bad behavior, but actually it's a deeply rooted coping mechanism. And we can actually tie this to an evolutionary concept from the research called the viability-vulnerability trade-off. See, male infants are often physically larger and more numerous at birth, but neurologically, they're much more vulnerable to early life stress. This really explains why early caregiving insults, things like maternal depression, neglect, or abuse, have such a uniquely devastating and lasting impact on boys, literally pushing them toward those externalizing behaviors we just talked about.
Moving on to Section 3. When trauma mimics ADHD. Check out this massive overlap in symptoms. We're talking difficulty concentrating, restlessness, distractibility, disorganization, hyperactivity. Now, if a kid walks into a clinic showing all of this, ADHD is the obvious guess, right? But here's the thing. Traumatic stress and ADHD actually affect the exact same areas of the brain. A traumatized child is often stuck in a state of hypervigilance. They're constantly scanning the room for danger. And to an outside observer, that hypervigilance looks exactly like ADHD distractibility and inattention.
And wow, the data really backs this up with a staggering statistic: 17%. Research suggests that up to 17% of children who have experienced trauma actually meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. I mean, that is a massive overlap. So why does this happen? Well, it all comes down to toxic stress. Prolonged fight-or-flight responses fundamentally rewire a child's developing brain. The regions involved in fear and impulsivity literally overproduce neural connections, while the areas for reasoning and behavioral control actually produce fewer. So these aren't just kids acting out. These are very real, maladaptive biological responses to trauma.
All right, let's look at Section 4, trauma in juvenile offenders.
Criminologists usually divide young offenders into two distinct trajectories. First, you have childhood onset offenders. These kids show delinquency very early, often before age 12, and they have significant neurodevelopmental risks and poor family backgrounds. Then, on the other hand, you have adolescent onset offenders. They start getting into trouble later, during their teen years, and they usually have far fewer early family background issues. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. Comparing these two groups reveals a pretty stark difference. The childhood onset offenders, the ones who started acting out the earliest, they suffer from massively higher rates of trauma and mental health comorbidity. The numbers really tell the story here. Nearly 70% have a psychiatric disorder, compared to about 43% in the adolescent onset group. Their emotional abuse scores are significantly higher too. It just proves that early vulnerabilities absolutely manifest as serious legal and behavioral issues later in life.
But honestly, here's a truly fascinating, nuanced finding from the data. While childhood trauma predicts mental health problems across the board, the actual link between the trauma and the psychopathology is surprisingly stronger in the adolescent onset group. Why is that? Well, because childhood onset offenders already have such complex underlying genetic and neurodevelopmental vulnerabilities mixed in. It's like a giant puzzle. It just shows how deeply tangled biology, environment, and trauma really are.
Finally, Section 5, Healing and Regaining Control. Okay, the good news, clinical therapies exist, and they are incredibly effective for treating PTSD and even co-occurring ADHD. The sources strongly recommend trauma-focused treatments. For instance, you've got EMDR, which helps reprocess traumatic memories. There's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, which specifically targets the thoughts and feelings tied to trauma. And of course, mindfulness and grounding exercises to manage that hypervigilant fight-or-flight nervous system. Speaking of grounding, I have to share this incredibly practical, actionable tool straight from the Teen CBT workbook we reviewed. It's the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. So, when a teen feels triggered or panicked, they pause and name 5 things they see, 4 things they touch, 3 they hear, 2 they smell, and 1 thing they taste. It sounds simple, right? But scientifically, it forces the brain's frontal cortex to engage, literally pulling the person out of a trauma flashback and right back into the safe, present moment. The workbook also guides teens to create a personalized chilling out plan. Basically, it's about replacing those destructive, externalizing behaviors we talked about earlier with safe coping mechanisms. Whether it's focused breathing, listening to music, creating some art, or just getting out and playing sports, having a predefined plan gives an anxious teen a clear roadmap to self-soothe when their neurobiology is just screaming at them to lash out. Therapy isn't just about fixing the bad stuff, either. It provides structured, safe ways to deal with all complex feelings. For example, it specifically helps teens navigate the really mixed feelings of saying goodbye and graduating from therapy itself. It just proves that with the right scaffolding, these young minds can absolutely learn to process complex transitions in a healthy way. I really want to leave you with this incredibly hopeful message directly from PTSD UK. Quote, "It is possible for PTSD to be successfully treated many years after the traumatic events occurred. It is never too late to seek help. The human brain is so incredibly resilient. Even if a child's development was derailed by early trauma, the capacity to heal remains intact for a lifetime." If you found this breakdown as fascinating as I did and you want to continue exploring the boy crisis, early childhood trauma, or behavioral interventions, definitely check out the excellent source materials we drew from today. They are phenomenal avenues for a deeper dive into the data we've explored. So, we'll wrap up today's explainer with a provocative question to take with you. What might change in our schools, our justice systems, and our families if we stopped looking at a disruptive kid and asking, "What's wrong with you?" and instead started asking, "What happened to you?" It's a massive paradigm shift, but as the data shows, it's the only one that truly leads to understanding and healing. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.